Okay, so the Washington Post continues. Opponents argue that teaching about gender identity is driven by liberal ideology and is inappropriate for children, especially young children. 5 states, including Florida, ban or limit how teachers can talk about gender identity and sexual orientation. Another 10 states are considering such measures. Books that feature transgender or non-binary characters have been subject to numerous ban attempts. The restrictions often go beyond the classrooms. Many districts have resisted efforts to allow transgender students to use the bathroom corresponding to their gender identity. 18 states limit transgender women from competing in women's and school sports. Though some measures are on hold pending court challenge. Philadelphia's school district came under fire for informing teachers about an independent trans wellness conference where some attendees discussed how to support youth who are transitioning genders. Well, I mean, that independent trans wellness conference literally talked about how you should tell small children that it's okay to transition to other genders and then not tell their parents. Classes that address gender identity are still an exception in American schools, but an increase in the number of young people identifying as trans or gender nonconforming has prompted many schools to change course and adopt lessons that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. A Gallup survey released last year found 16% of young adults in Gen Z identify as LGBT more than any other generation. What a coincidence! It's a coincidence. Again, I love the idea that the left is promoting that all of this is just naturally happening and it has nothing to do with us spewing garbage propaganda at kids for years on end, and then these kids going on horrible social media sites like TikTok and finding mentally ill people to create an echo chamber where they can be cat self. Like, it's amazing to me. We're supposed to believe this isn't a social contagion. It is so obviously and clearly a social contagion. There is no question that this is a social contagion. It is the definition of a social contagion. I honest to God can't, how do you even try to logically sustain the idea this is not a social contagion? It's area specific. It is happening in coordination with specific ingestion of particular messages. And it's being promoted by every major corporation in America. How is this not a social contagion? It's just insanity. The Washington Post, however, says, quote, the approaches vary, particularly for elementary school children. In some classrooms, lessons about gender identity focus on gender stereotypes. Students in first grade, for instance, may be prompted to consider there are no boy colors or girl colors. Some classes use the book I Am Jazz, the story of a transgender girl. I have a girl brain but a boy body, she says. This is called transgender. I was born this way. No, you were not. You were born a boy. There is no such thing as a quote-unquote girl brain in a boy body. It does not exist. That is not a thing. There is no significant study that has ever shown via brain scan that this is a possibility. This is just... By the way, I noticed they never follow up with Jazz Jennings' story. It turns out that Jazz Jennings has serious mental health issues even now. That the transition did not solve all of Jazz Jennings' problems. But you won't have follow-up on that. The idea is that Jazz Jennings is a perfectly normal, wonderful girl because this is you can magically just do this. No problem whatsoever. Everything is hunky-dory. And then I wonder why more people are identifying this way, especially when they get celebrated by their school and told they are brave and told they are heroes and told they should be proud and that you should be prouder for believing that you're a member of the opposite sex than you should be for actually believing the biological reality about yourself, which is that you are a member of the sex to which you are born. And it's being pressed forward by, again, every major institution in our country. Every major institution in our country is pressing this stuff forward. How clearly is this a social contagion? There's a professor of politics at the Manhattan Institute named Eric Kaufman. He put together a thread on Twitter that basically tells the story. Quote, the LGBT share among young Americans tripled in the last decade to 21%. Trans and non-binary identification may be up as much as 1,000%. Data from the General Social Survey shows that LGBT identification has been diverging from same-sex behavior. LGBT identity has risen 11 points among Americans under 30 since 2008. Same-sex behavior has only risen 4 points. So in other words, you have a bunch of people who are now identifying as trans or non-binary or queer who are actually just straight. For example, bisexuals are close to half the LGBT total and predominantly female. But the GSS shows the share of bisexual women with exclusively male partners in the previous 5 years increased from 13% in 2008-2010 to 55% in 2018-2021. So you now have a huge number of women who say they are bisexual who have only had sex with men in the past 3 years, which sort of suggests that this is a social contagion. We reached peak trends in 2020, says Eric Kaufman. Fire data collected on 57,000 undergrads from 2021 shows that in 50 colleges sampled in both years, the non-binary share dropped from 1.5% to 0.85%, a statistically significant decline with younger, less trans. UK and Canadian data basically show the same thing. The LGBT surge is sociopolitical, heavily siloed among very liberal young people. The GSS shows that the heterosexual share dropped 20 points to 66% within the most liberal fifth of the young people. It changed far less among the others. So still, upwards of 85% of everybody outside of the just liberal group identifies as straight in the United States. And if you're talking about people who are slightly liberal, they identify as solely straight at an almost 95% rate. If you consider yourself a liberal, only 1 in 3 people who considers themselves liberal now says they're LGBTQ. Because guess what? You get to be the most treasured and prized people in America if you do this. Political aspect is the most important for white and college educated. Fire data shows very liberal white female student who supports the idea of shouting down a speaker to prevent them speaking has about a 7 in 10 chance of being LGBT. So if you're a censorious, nasty liberal who thinks it's okay to shut down speakers, good shot, you're LGBT. By contrast, almost none of the 1,360 very conservative male students with Christian affiliation in the fire data say they're LGBT. 52% of students taking highly political majors like race and gender studies identify as LGBT, compared to 25% among students overall. Those in social sciences and humanities are about 10 points more LGBT than those in STEM. This is total social contagion, guys. Census data from the UK and Canada suggests surveys overestimate LGBT share by 2 to 3 times. For instance, 26% of more than 5,000 18 to 20-year-olds on YouGov's UK panel identified as LGBT. But the census pilot estimates for 16 to 24-year-olds show only 7.6% do. Plus, LGBT and the mental health crisis, it seems that we have a major uptick in the mental health crisis along with LGBT identification. Who said this months ago? Who was saying this? Oh yeah, it was me. The nexus of liberalism, sexuality, and mental health needs analysis. A boundary-transgressing liberal culture could be destabilizing for some. Very liberal people are both more likely to be LGBT and more likely to suffer mental illness by a huge margin. Assuming becoming very liberal involves both innate dispositions and exposure to messages, it's reasonable to assume that a culture which encourages boundary transgression and vulnerability could prompt people to identify as sad or anxious, as with LGBT identity. Again, this is correct. This is right. And which is just one reason why the best governor in America, Ron DeSantis, has now moved to ban transition care for minors in the state of Florida. On Thursday, he asked the state board regulating doctors to ban transition-related care for transgender minors, which is genital mutilation and hormone therapy for minors in the state of Florida, which is correct because all of this is barbaric garbage. The state health department made the request hours after another state agency issued a 46-page report to justify banning Medicaid coverage for transgender people of any age who want puberty blockers, hormone therapies, or gender assignment surgery. In other words, this should not be taxpayer-sponsored. The two-pronged effort, which ensures that DeSantis can act quickly and without the need for legislative approval, drew instant opposition from activists. Oh, well, the activists. Oh, no. Florida Surgeon General Joseph Ladapo, who oversees the health department, supports this. In April, Ladapo issued guidance recommending against transgender treatment for minors who feel their bodies and gender identities are, quote-unquote, misaligned. This, of course, contradicted guidance issued by the federal government and Joe Biden. In a partial answer to criticisms, Florida's Agency for Healthcare Administration issued a report Thursday questioning the science and safety of hormone therapies, puberty blockers, and gender assignment surgery. Ladapo then asked the Florida Medical Board of Medicine to establish a standard of care Thursday that would result in prohibiting doctors from prescribing therapies for transgender youths. This is correct and this is good because forget in 100 years, in 5 years, everyone is going to recognize that this is total, complete, utter insanity. So, Ron DeSantis he's at it again, being the best governor. Man, I love the state where I live. It's just great. So, as a precursor to understand what he is doing, you have to understand that the way that the left approaches bullying corporations and doing what they want. So, John Feinstein, who's a terrific sports writer, but he has a piece in the Washington Post titled, "Texas Shouldn't Host the NCAA's Final Fours Until It Fixes Its Gun Laws. So now we should have private corporations like the NCAA that spend their days trying to cudgel states into doing what John Feinstein wants with regard to gun laws. Quote, if the NCAA had any moral standards, it would move next year's men's and women's Final Fours out of Texas. It would move all its other championships from the state too. It would vow not to return until Texas reforms its gun laws. This is a moment to put the usual excuse-making aside and do something that affects more than the wallets of NCAA members, etc., etc., etc. There is precedent and evidence that the NCAA can leverage the impact of its events to protest political action and play a role in bringing about meaningful change. In 2001, when lawmakers in South Carolina refused to remove the Confederate flag from the grounds of the State House, the NCAA announced it would not place any pre-scheduled events in the state until the flag was gone. In 2015, the flag was taken down, the NCAA began scheduling events there again. So clearly, first of all, that doesn't show the impact and efficacy of the NCAA. That is a 14-year gap between the NCAA announcing action and then the sought action occurring. Do you really think it was the NCAA that prompted that action? One of the first NCAA events held in the state after that victory was the 2017 men's basketball tournament regional. That event was held in Greenville after the NCAA pulled it out of Greensboro, North Carolina, in response to an anti-LGBT measure. Pressure from the NCAA and NBA led to the repeal of that law in 2017. That one was more immediate because, as we see, the attempt to use corporate power to cudgel public bodies into doing what they want is sometimes effective. Well, there's no reason that corporations that decide to poke their nose into politics should receive special state benefits. There's no reason why they should get special state giveaways. It's one thing to say that every business ought to be treated alike. It's another thing to say that you should be given a special state dispensation in order to promote politics that run counter to the interests of the taxpayers of a state who, and in ultra-crepidarian fashion, are addressing issues outside their purview. Disney has no business with regard to teaching sexual orientation and gender identity to kindergartners. And the Tampa Bay Devil Rays do not receive a major taxpayer infusion of funds. Like, first of all, I'm generally against this anyway, but they should not receive a major taxpayer infusion of funds while simultaneously sounding off on gun control. Like, the answer is no. You don't get to use my money to promote your policy provisions. That's not the way this works. According to USF News, Ron DeSantis signed a record $109 billion budget for the fiscal year beginning July 1, but his vetoes included funds for a Pasco sports complex and H. Lee Moffitt Cancer Center facility in Pasco County. So, what exactly did he veto? Well, one of the things that he vetoed is a spring training facility for the Tampa Bay Rays. There's a $35 million subsidy for a sports complex in Pasco County. That followed hard upon the Tampa Bay Rays tweeting out a giant statement about how the state of Florida needs more gun control. Here's the deal, guys. You can do that, but you can't expect me to pay for it. Well done, Governor DeSantis, once again. Did you know that every single like creates one additional leftist tier? That is just science.